In the suffocatingly still atmosphere of our family living room in the ancient city of Savannah, the faint scent of herbal tea suddenly turned bitter as I was forced to witness a scene of cold-blooded betrayal. My name is Shelby, and I am 31 years old, standing there frozen in shock while watching my own flesh and blood heartlessly strip away the last bit of dignity from the woman who had sacrificed her entire life for us. My older sister shattered the heavy silence by declaring that placing Mother in a nursing home would lift the burden of care from all of our busy shoulders, as if Mom were nothing more than a piece of unwanted luggage. She spoke with a calculatedly smooth tone, while her greedy hand smoothed out the legal documents that would officially strip away my mother's home and her entire history. Everyone in that room nodded with a terrifyingly indifferent attitude, while my mother sat there small and defeated with her eyes fixed on the frayed patterns of the floor rug. My brother-in-law approached with a shiny gold-plated fountain pen and thrust it near her fragile skin, which was marked with visible veins in a malicious urgency that made my blood boil with rage. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as my mother reached out her hand while her fingers trembled so violently that the pen clattered against the wooden table before she could find the final strength to grip it firmly. I quietly watched a colorless tear fall onto Mother's sweater collar as she scribbled her name, agreeing to give up the achievements of an entire lifetime just to satisfy the selfishness of children who had always viewed her as a nuisance. My sister exchanged a triumphant glance with her husband because she believed they had won a complete victory, but they failed to notice the determination slowly returning to my mother's tear-filled eyes. They mistook our silent resignation for a total defeat, without knowing that this heartbreaking moment of surrender was the silent spark for a quest for justice that they were never prepared to face. If the image of a mother being rejected by her own children makes your heart ache, just as it is suffocating mine, then please stay to witness what happens next. You should subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications right now, because the ending of this story will prove that a mother's love and sacrifice are things that must never be underestimated. The glamour of the expensive designer clothes that Meredith always draped over herself was like a polished coat of paint covering the decay and despair within the financial failures surrounding her. Although she always appeared before the Savannah elite as a top real estate broker, her lavish lifestyle was actually a soulless corpse built on a pile of high-interest loans and massive credit card debts waiting to collapse. I watched quietly as she adjusted her silk scarf with fake elegance right in Mother's kitchen to pretend she was still a successful lady, while in reality, she was drowning in the panic of someone about to be foreclosed on by the bank. Meredith had spent the past 3 years merely maintaining the shell of extreme wealth, even though her actual commissions had long since dried up. After the housing market began to weed out those with fraudulent and aggressive business tactics like hers. Grant sat right next to her with a tablet in his hand and cold eyes scanning through a spreadsheet that had transformed Mother's entire medical history into a list of debts that needed to be eliminated immediately. He cleared his throat calculatingly before declaring that the cost of home nursing care was a pointless waste that we simply could not continue to tolerate in this fiscal quarter. Grant argued in the tone of a warehouse manager liquidating inventory that getting rid of Mom into a nursing facility would save over $4,000 a month to serve their despicable personal purposes. The cruelty in Grant's voice made me shiver because he was disregarding Mother's life, like an old piece of merchandise that needed to be discarded to cut losses for the family budget. I tried to take a deep breath to suppress my anger, and then gently suggested the option of taking Mom to my apartment so that I could directly care for her without costing any more expensive fees from those nursing centers. Meredith immediately let out a bitterly mocking laugh that echoed throughout the high ceilings of the house where we both had grown up under the protection of our mother. She looked at me with utter contempt and then declared that a lowly library employee living in a cramped corner absolutely had no status to care for a woman of Mother's standing. Meredith asserted that it would be a shameful embarrassment to the fake reputation she had painstakingly built if partners discovered her mother was living in a shabby apartment in a working-class neighborhood. She insisted that Mom needed professional care, even though I understood perfectly well that Meredith's only concern was to get rid of Mother quickly so she could sell out the ancestral villa to cover up her filthy personal debts. My sister then buried her head in her phone to pretend she was handling urgent work, but her trembling fingers betrayed the cowardice and lies happening right behind our poor mother's back. I accidentally caught a glimpse of the screen and realized Meredith was not contacting any clients, but was actually sending photos of the house's interior to a distressed asset buyer to receive an advance payment, even while Mother was still sitting there. Even as Mom sat quietly in the sunroom, Meredith had already begun to list for sale every square meter of wooden flooring and the family's classic decorative details as if butchering a beast that had just been trapped. She was treating the legacy of our ancestors like a pile of scrap metal that could be exchanged for cash, and was preparing to strip away Mother's memories before she could even realize her daughter's betrayal. The hierarchy of power in this room became suffocating, as Meredith always used the label of hollow success to extinguish any voice of conscience that I tried to utter. She had turned herself into a family tyrant through years of manipulation, along with boasts about her superior intelligence and earning ability compared to everyone around her. I looked at Mom as she remained silent while Grant continued to ramble on about rising medication prices and the economic benefits if we sold all the real estate before the fiscal year ended. It gradually became clear that this couple had staged a trashy play together to ensure that I no longer had any chance to intervene or take Mother to a place of true peace. Meredith stood up and paced the kitchen floor with the sound of her high heels pounding down, sounding like a hammer, hitting a coffin signaling the end of Mother at this home filled with memories. She uttered hypocritical words about progress and the importance of making difficult decisions for the benefit of the family's future legacy. Every word that slid out of Meredith's mouth reeked of lies intended to cover the reality that she was being submerged by vanity and needed to sell out her mother to save her own hollow honor. I felt a wave of disgust rise to my throat when I realized that my own sister cared more about her social face than the breath and life of the woman who had raised her with all her heart. 10 days had passed since the night my mother signed the sentence of her own exile, and the rapid transformation of this ancestral home felt like a brutal massacre of memories executed by the cold-blooded hands of Meredith. She began her so-called liquidation campaign with a sickening bloodlust while moving through the hallways with the attitude of a hunter, butchering prey, instead of a daughter standing in her parents' home. She spent the entire morning tossing the priceless keepsakes of our late father into cheap cardboard boxes, and the hollow thud of those mementos sounded like the shattering of my own heart as I watched from the stairs. I stood frozen in the shadows to witness my sister violently stuffing the leather-bound journals that contained my father's entire soul into trash bags with a spiteful expression because she felt they were slowing down her progress in selling the house. The inherent sacred silence of our family was now completely torn apart by the screeching sound of packing tape, which was a haunting noise, signaling the systematic execution of every beloved corner in my mother's life. The bitterness in my throat rose to the surface when I discovered that Meredith had secretly sold off the antique grandfather clock, which was the only remaining wedding gift from my father, along with all the precious literary manuscripts he had cherished for half a century. I found a handwritten list on the kitchen counter detailing the cold cash value for the items that were once the soul of the house, but in the eyes of a wicked person like Meredith, they were just piles of scrap metal to be exchanged for money to satisfy her vanity. When I tried to plead with her to leave the clock as a memento, Meredith did not even bother to look up, but only gave me a venomous glare along with the declaration that Mom would never again be lucid enough to recognize anything in her nursing home cell. Her brazenness and moral decay made me feel utterly disgusted, because I knew perfectly well that she was using the money traded for mother's tears to pay off her luxury debts and her rotting real estate office. Amidst the wreckage of memories, my mother observed everything from the old armchair in the sunroom with a heart-wrenching level of composure, which was a silence that made my heart feel strangled with pity for her resignation. Mom did not utter a single word when Meredith violently snatched the family photos down from the mantelpiece, or even when the movers dragged away the oak dining table that had once been warmed by our laughter for decades. This pathetic passivity led Meredith to develop a contemptuous assumption that Mother had completely lost her cognitive ability and was now merely a soulless corpse waiting to be tossed into a nursing home. I stood there watching Meredith pat Mother's shoulder with a condescending and fake smile, while treating the woman who gave birth to her as an obstacle that had been fully conquered and held no further value in her cruel world. However, behind the blurry veil of tears, I suddenly saw Mother's eyes quietly following Meredith's every small movement with a strange alertness, and that look contained a profound pain, but also carried a mysterious determination that a wicked person like my sister would never be able to comprehend. To begin the battle to reclaim justice for my poor mother, I waited until Meredith went out to dress up and brag to her vain friends before secretly contacting Mr. Abernathy, who was a longtime close friend and loyal lawyer of my late father. I spoke to him in a terrified whisper from the corner of the back garden, while pleading with him to re-examine the entire legality of the documents that Meredith had used dirty tricks to force Mother to sign. Abernathy went silent with shock at the cruelty of Meredith, and promised to use all his power to meet me privately to review any clues I could sneak out of my sister's always locked office. He reminded me that my father was an extremely cautious man who would never rest in peace if he knew the future of his virtuous wife was placed in the hands of someone with a devilish heart like Meredith. That call brought me a flickering light in the dark night of despair and made me realize I could no longer be a weak librarian, but must become a shield protecting Mother from the attack of cold-blooded relatives. With a final spark of hope, I bravely entered the damp and dark basement where Meredith had not yet reached to wipe away the final traces of sacred paternal love. I spent many hours laboring in the dust, searching through rusty metal cabinets and rotting boxes for a miracle that could save the house from collapse. My bleeding fingers suddenly touched a hidden compartment concealed behind a loose brick at the base of the foundation wall, revealing an old leather folder that radiated a massive spiritual weight. Inside that folder was a secondary will that my father had secretly drafted only a few months before he passed away, which was a sacred document never before announced in the family's official probate records. This will contained ironclad clauses to protect the old villa from any illegal sale, without the written consent of both children, along with a certification of Mother's absolute mental lucidity. As I read my father's forceful words, I burst into tears of happiness, knowing that Meredith was building her castle on a giant legal lie, and I would be the one to directly pull it down to reclaim justice for my mother. 2 weeks had slowly crawled by since the day my mother was brutally cast out from the only home she had ever known, and the heavy weight of her absence felt like a bleeding wound gnawing at my soul every single day. I decided to make an unannounced visit to the St. Jude Care Facility because the sickening intuition regarding Meredith's cruelty made my heart unable to find even a single moment of peace. When I arrived at the glamorous main entrance where Meredith had boastfully described a luxury paradise, a nurse looked at me with a gaze full of pity before leading me deep into a decaying wing tucked away behind moldy and damp walls. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as I witnessed my mother being imprisoned in a cramped room that reeked of cheap industrial bleach and chilling loneliness instead of the high-end suite promised by my sister's hollow lies. She was sitting huddled on a rusted iron chair with her clouded eyes staring blankly at a gray brick wall, as if she were desperately trying to find the silhouette of our beloved home within the memories being stripped away from her. All the warm clothes I had personally prepared for her were gone, and instead, she wore a thin, soiled institutional gown that made her withered body look even more pitiful and small amidst the freezing cold of that neglected space. I rushed to her side and collapsed onto my knees at her feet, grasping her frail and dry hands, which were covered in dark bruises caused by the negligence of the nursing staff, while I struggled to suppress the agonizing sobs rising from my chest. Mother looked at me with tear-filled eyes that still radiated a startling clarity before she tremblingly leaned in to whisper that she had been forced to endure this humiliation just to wait for the day I found the truth. She choked back tears as she revealed that she had accepted signing those transfer documents as a final sacrifice to unmask the demonic nature of Meredith and Grant before it was far too late for our family. Mother explained through her weeping that those documents were actually legally worthless drafts, because they lacked the final notary seal, which was a trap she and my father had secretly prepared long ago to protect the family from ungrateful children. She had endured living in these miserable conditions just to make them become overconfident so that they would personally expose the criminal evidence we would use to demand justice in this final battle. The fury within me erupted like a wildfire when I used my guardianship rights to check the billing records and discovered a truth even more cruel than death itself. Grant had cold-bloodedly forged every invoice to deceive me about the premium care costs, while in reality he only paid a pittance to dump Mother into this dilapidated and wretched room. He had shamelessly pocketed more than 60% of the retirement money Mother had saved her entire life, stuffing his own pockets to save his failing investments, while Mother had to eat cold meals and lacked basic medication. I stood in the middle of the administrative office with those bills stained with blood and tears in my hands, feeling an utter revulsion that my own flesh and blood would treat Mother's life as a commodity to be bargained and profited from. It was a terrifying moral bankruptcy that no words could ever fully describe, especially since the perpetrator always spoke of family values during every holiday gathering we ever had. Taking advantage of the strict United States laws regarding medical privacy, I requested a full audit of Mother's medical charts and discovered that Meredith had completely abandoned her health during this entire period. She had signed orders to cancel every physical therapy session necessary for Mother's weak legs, just to save a few measly dollars to fund her own vain and frivolous parties. This heartless indifference toward the physical recovery of her own biological mother was undeniable proof of a breach of fiduciary duty and the total collapse of Meredith's humanity. I felt a surge of cold and determined power flowing through my veins as I realized that their own blind arrogance had led them to dig the grave of their own reputation. They had looked down on my mother as a worthless ruin without ever knowing that her wisdom and love were the strongest fortress that they would never be able to overcome. At the end of that evening, as darkness fell over the St. Jude facility, like a mournful mist, Mr. Abernathy quietly appeared under the guise of a social visitor so that we could unite without being detected by Meredith's spies. We sat together in the dark corner of the withered garden, where only the sound of the wind whistling through the dry branches bore witness to the oath of a family being torn apart. Mother tremblingly took out an encrypted memory card hidden deep within the lining of her torn cardigan, which contained all the evidence of secret accounts and property documents my father had left for her. Mr. Abernathy looked at those documents with a stern gaze and confirmed that the supplemental will I found in the basement was indeed the sort of justice that would sever all of Meredith's filthy schemes. We held hands tightly under the flickering lights of the nursing home, three suffering but determined people ready for a spectacular overthrow to punish those who dared to trample on the most sacred bond of motherhood. A full month had drifted by since Meredith had discarded our mother into the nursing home, like a piece of bothersome debt, and during this time her insane self-complacency had fermented into a lethal venom. She strutted through our family's ancestral colonial villa with the triumphant smirk of a criminal who had successfully executed a perfect heist against the very woman who gave her life. Meredith had recklessly secured a massive high-interest bank loan by using our sacred family land as a sacrificial pawn for a risky virtual real estate project she believed would crown her as the queen of Savannah society. I watched her silently as she drained glasses of expensive liquor, while staring at digital figures on her screen with a blind and ruthless hunger for money that surpassed all human emotion. In the hollow heart of this unfilial daughter, there was not a single ripple of conscience regarding the fact that her mother was shriveled in a squalid infirmary, while she burned through cash on dreams built upon the blood and bones of her parents. To accelerate her descent into a bottomless pit of self-destruction as quickly as possible, I began to feign absolute submission to her dictatorial authority, and even stepped forward to help her finalize the sale procedures on luxury social media platforms. I spent entire days crafting glamorous advertisements for the house where we were raised, while Meredith gleefully enjoyed the sensation of trampling over my self-respect, without ever sensing the deadly trap closing in on her. My artificial cooperation made Meredith so arrogant and careless that she began to view me as a devoted slave in her journey of betraying our own mother. She was so intoxicated by this illusion of power that she never paused to wonder why a sister who had protested so fiercely would suddenly change her attitude with such suspicious speed. Meanwhile, Grant proved to be equally despicable in his moral decay, as he had already placed a non-refundable deposit on a luxury yacht, using funds he intended to seize from the forced sale of Mother's legacy. He spoke nonchalantly to maritime brokers about extravagant parties at sea, while the minimum funds for Mother's medication were heartlessly slashed without a shred of mercy. I stood behind the study door and heard Grant's sickening laughter as he bragged about how easily they had fooled that senile old woman and how they would enjoy a regal life built on the pain of others. The corruption of this couple's character had reached an intolerable level, where every word they spoke felt like a jagged blade stabbing into the soul of our family. Grant even began preparing a guest list for a lavish housewarming party on the very land he was actively stealing from a mother who was dying of loneliness. Just as Meredith's arrogance reached its absolute zenith, a mysterious buyer with infinite financial resources emerged under the brilliant coordination of Mr. Abernathy to deliver the final killing blow. This shadow investor presented an offer so tempting that it felt supernatural, provided that Meredith signed irrevocable financial commitments within an extremely narrow window of time. Because she was being hounded by creditors and was desperate for cash to hide her mounting losses, Meredith frantically signed a mountain of documents without ever suspecting the lethal binding clauses hidden inside. She had effectively signed the death warrant for her own career by committing all her personal assets to guarantee a transaction for a property she had no legal right to sell. Greed had rendered Meredith so foolish that she sold her very soul to a legal ghost that Mr. Abernathy had meticulously constructed to demand justice for my mother. As the deadlines for her bank loans approached, the atmosphere in the house became thick with tension because creditors began to circle Meredith like vultures waiting for a rotting carcass. She screamed frantically into her phone, trying to shift phantom funds in desperation while still attempting to maintain the elegant facade of a successful lady before the local media. Meredith was completely unaware that every instance of her financial fraud and her conspiracy to embezzle assets had been fully recorded by us to be unleashed during her upcoming fake housewarming party. She was still dreaming of future glory without realizing that she was trapped in a financial labyrinth with no exit, and every dollar she borrowed was becoming a shackle dragging her down to hell. I stood quietly in the kitchen and witnessed Meredith barking orders at the catering staff to prepare champagne for a celebration that would actually serve as a public tribunal for her crimes. The contrast between her glamorous exterior and her rotten internal nature made me feel so disgusted that I wanted to scream at the sheer treachery of a human being. Grant was still intoxicated by dreams of his new yacht, without noticing that the storm of justice was preparing to sweep away everything they had stolen. Every chess piece had been placed in its perfect position, and this flawless snare only awaited the final push to crush the pride of those who dared to sell out their beloved mother for filthy coins. This was not going to be a celebration of success, but an execution of Meredith and Grant's honor on the sacred soil they had betrayed. 3 months had passed since the day Meredith discarded our mother into misery, and now the ancestral villa had been transformed by her into a flashy stage reeking of filthy money to flaunt her fake success before a crowd of greedy associates. I stood tucked away in the corner of the ballroom feeling nauseous as I witnessed Meredith gliding in a shimmering sequined dress, while her fake smile radiated like a queen granting favors to subordinates, even though those hands were barely dry from signing contracts that sold out her own mother. She held a glass of red wine as bright as blood and solemnly declared her filial piety and her relentless efforts to preserve the family tradition, which was a brazen performance that made the surrounding atmosphere suffocating with a sickening level of deceit. Meredith suddenly ordered the spotlight to focus on me and spoke in a bitterly sarcastic voice to publicly humiliate her librarian sister's poverty in front of hundreds of wealthy guests. She nonchalantly defamed me as a stain on the family lineage and a failure clinging to the past while claiming she was the only one bringing glory and light to the family name. The contemptuous laughter of the crowd accompanying Meredith's words was suddenly extinguished completely when the main doors swung open and Mom appeared with a majestic and elegant presence that made everyone present freeze in absolute horror. She was no longer the haggard woman in a hospital gown, but a true lady with eyes as sharp as if they wanted to pierce through the thick mask of her unfilial daughter. Meredith and Grant stood frozen in place with their faces distorted by fear, as their eyes bulged out as if they could not believe the truth that the mother they thought was being tormented in a cheap nursing home could stand here to judge their sins. The clarity and power radiating from Mom was like a thunderous slap to Meredith's long-standing self-complacency, and it transformed her from a superior figure into a trembling mouse before the light of truth. The insults that Meredith had just thrown at me were still echoing in the air, but now they had become nooses tightening slowly around her own neck. Amidst Meredith's clumsy attempts to find a way to save face with awkward lies, a convoy of economic police and bank representatives suddenly burst into the main hall like an unstoppable storm of justice. The law enforcement officers marched straight toward Meredith and solemnly announced a freeze on all her assets, as well as her arrest for the crimes of forging loan documents and serious asset embezzlement. The guests who had just been cheering for Meredith moments ago scrambled to flee like rats from a sinking ship, leaving her standing solitary in the middle of the vast room with a pathetically frantic expression. Grant tried to hide behind the curtains, but he was quickly handcuffed as the police announced evidence of him embezzling Mother's care funds for luxury shopping. Meredith screamed frantically and tried to use her hollow power to threaten the officers, but all she received was absolute contempt from everyone around her. To completely extinguish the last bit of hope for this pretender, I stepped forward and presented the legally signed land transfer agreement executed under the strict supervision of Mr. Abernathy. I looked deep into Meredith's eyes, which were bloodshot with rage, and declared that this villa now officially belonged to a charity fund for abandoned elderly people, instead of being owned by an unfilial person like her. Meredith collapsed onto the polished floor in her expensive dress, which had now become ridiculous, while her wailing was not out of remorse, but for the regret of the filthy money that had vanished into thin air. She had personally dug her own grave when she signed irrevocable financial commitments, effectively turning herself into a penniless person, facing a long prison sentence for her blind mistakes. The sight of the most hypocritical person on earth, having her internal decay exposed at the peak of her arrogance, brought a profound satisfaction to everyone who had witnessed my mother's pain. The bank officials began to seize and seal every valuable item in the house, while Meredith was escorted to the police car amidst the cold stares of neighbors who had once admired her. Grant walked dejectedly behind with the cowardly face of a man who had just lost everything he had stolen, and they left the ancestral home in a heavy and mournful silence. Mom stood beside me with her hands tightly held, and she followed the police car disappearing into the Savannah night with a strange serenity, as if she had just shed 1,000-pound weight from her thin shoulders. Justice had truly been served not through violent revenge, but through the very greedy traps that Meredith had set for herself. The collapse of a deceitful empire closed a dark chapter in our family history and returned peace to the souls of the departed and dignity to my venerable mother. The devastating truth hung in the air like a heavy fog immediately after the revelation in the middle of the ballroom, and the silence was only broken by the sharp metallic click of Mr. Abernathy, activating the integrated sound system of the villa. He did not wait for Meredith to regain her composure before playing a series of crystal-clear audio recordings that captured her voice, dripping with absolute malice, while she discussed her plans to treat Mom as a disposable piece of trash. Every guest in the room heard her cold admission that she viewed the family estate as nothing more than a carcass to be picked clean before moving on to her next high society conquest. The recordings revealed a level of calculated cruelty that made even the most hardened business partners turn away in physical revulsion as they realized they had been drinking champagne with a monster who traded her mother's soul for a bridge loan. Meredith stood paralyzed in the center of the hall, while her own recorded voice echoed against the gilded walls like a final judgment that no amount of stolen money could ever silence. Grant realized the ship was sinking faster than he could escape, and he immediately turned toward the crowd to loudly disclaim any responsibility for the fraudulent schemes his wife had orchestrated with such terrifying precision. He began to point a shaking, greasy finger at Meredith while shouting that he was merely a victim of her feminine manipulation and had been kept in total darkness about the forgery of the bank documents. His desperate attempt to save his own pathetic reputation only earned him the collective scorn of the business associates who looked at him with an expression of pure disgust for such a cowardly and gutless betrayal of his own spouse. Grant's voice cracked into a shrill whine as he tried to plead his case to the bank representatives, but they ignored his excuses while continuing to document the assets that would be seized before the first light of dawn. The pathetic display of a husband abandoning his wife to the wolves just to save his own skin only added a layer of profound ugliness to the already shattered atmosphere of the evening. The prestigious guests began to leave the mansion in a hurried and silent exodus, while Meredith watched her entire social identity evaporate in a matter of minutes as she realized she was now completely and utterly penniless. She reached for her designer handbag with trembling fingers to call her private attorney, only to find that her high-limit credit cards had already been flagged and declined by the automated banking security systems. The representatives from the financial institution informed her with clinical indifference that every single one of her accounts had been frozen due to the credible allegations of systemic credit fraud and the impending criminal investigation. Meredith stood in the ruins of her fake celebration while realizing that the house she had spent thousands to renovate was no longer a home, but a prison that she no longer had the right to occupy. The humiliation was absolute as she watched the people she once looked down upon walk past her without even offering a single glance of pity while they whispered about her impending imprisonment. Mom stepped forward from the shadows with a calm and regal dignity that made everyone in the room feel small, and she held out her hand to take back the vintage fountain pen that Meredith had once used to sign her mother's life away. She stood directly in front of her oldest daughter and used that very same pen to sign a formal eviction notice that Mr. Abernathy had prepared to remove the wretched couple from the premises within the hour. Mom's hand did not shake as she finalized the document which declared that Meredith and Grant were now nothing more than trespassers on property that had been legally gifted to a national charity. The irony of the situation was sharp and painful, as Meredith was forced to face the same cold and heartless expulsion she had inflicted upon her mother only a few short months ago. Mom looked into the eyes of the daughter who had betrayed her and spoke with a voice that was firm and devoid of any lingering affection for the hollow creature Meredith had become. The logistical reality of the collapse became even more terrifying for the couple as the bank officials began to change the digital locks on the front doors, while the movers started cataloging the expensive furniture for immediate liquidation. Meredith tried to argue that she had nowhere to go in the middle of the night, but the law enforcement officers reminded her that her own actions had forfeited any right to mercy or human consideration from this family. She was forced to pack a few small suitcases in the dark, while the echoes of her own recorded lies continued to play in her mind like a haunting soundtrack to her total moral failure. Grant was seen outside arguing with a taxi driver because his primary debit cards were also blocked, and he had no way to pay for a ride away from the wreckage of the life he had tried to steal. The empire they had tried to build on a foundation of absolute deceit had vanished as quickly as a summer storm, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a lifetime of legal battles. As the clock struck midnight and the last of the lights were turned off by the new trustees of the charity fund, I stood on the porch with Mom and watched the taillights of the police car fade into the darkness. The cool night air felt like a cleansing breath for the villa which had been suffocated by greed and manipulation for far too long under Meredith's toxic and arrogant control. We walked back inside the quiet halls where the spirit of my father seemed to finally find peace now that the family honor had been restored through cold and calculated justice. Mom leaned against my shoulder with a sense of profound relief while we prepared to spend our first night back in the home that had been saved from the brink of total destruction. The battle was over, and though the scars would remain forever, the truth had finally won the grand war against the shadows of betrayal that had nearly consumed every piece of our lives. 4 months had passed since the final echoes of the legal storm faded into the background of Savannah's history, and the life we once knew had been replaced by a peaceful silence that felt like a long-awaited reward after so many days of waiting. Meredith was now forced to live in a cramped and decaying apartment on the outskirts of the city, where the walls were thin and the air was perpetually heavy with the smell of failure and cheap cleaning chemicals. She spent her grueling days performing manual labor at a local warehouse to pay off the massive civil judgments that the banks had levied against her due to her previous fraudulent activities. I heard from old acquaintances that she had been forced to sell every single designer item she ever owned just to keep the electricity running in her squalid new reality. Her hands, which used to be meticulously manicured, were now covered in blisters and scars from the reality of a life built on actual hard work, instead of the grand illusion she used to inhabit. Grant fared even worse as he was promptly fired from his prestigious financial firm, after the details of his betrayal and professional incompetence became public knowledge among the elite circles of the city. He had fallen into a deep and dark pit of addiction because he no longer possessed the courage to face the judgmental stares of the people who used to invite him to their exclusive galas. Savannah society had completely blacklisted him, and he now spent all his afternoons in dimly lit bars drinking away the remains of his shattered dignity while complaining to anyone who would listen about how he was unfairly treated. There were rumors that he had tried to contact Meredith for money, but she was so focused on her own survival that she had blocked his number and left him to rot in his own self-pity. Their toxic union had dissolved into a bitter memory, proving that a connection built on greed can never survive the cold winds of genuine hardship. Mom and I decided to leave the heavy weight of the past behind by embarking on an extensive road trip across the United States to reclaim the freedom that had been stolen from us for so many years. We were traveling comfortably using the substantial inheritance that Dad had secretly left for us in a protected offshore account, which Meredith never even knew existed until it was far too late for her to interfere. We watched the sunset over the Grand Canyon and shared quiet breakfasts in small diners throughout Montana, finally enjoying the simple pleasures of a life that was no longer defined by someone else's malice. Mom looked 10 years younger as she breathed in the fresh mountain air because her mind was sharp and her spirit was finally liberated from the fear of being discarded like a piece of old furniture. We spent our evenings planning for the future instead of ruminating on the betrayals of the past, knowing that we were finally the true architects of our own destiny. To ensure our peace of mind remained permanent, I changed every piece of our contact information and instructed Mr. Abernathy to handle any further legal inquiries with a cold and professional distance. Meredith had tried to reach out multiple times through desperate emails and social media accounts, begging for help and claiming that she had finally learned her lesson about the importance of family. I never responded with even a single word to those pleas, because I knew that her regret was not born of genuine love, but of the unbearable weight of her current poverty. I felt no guilt in cutting her out of our lives completely, because some bridges are burned so thoroughly that there is no path back to reconciliation regardless of how much time passes. We were moving forward into a bright and beautiful world that had no room for the poison she had tried to inject into our souls for her own selfish gain. As we conclude this long and painful journey, I want to share 3 profound lessons that we learned about human nature and the necessity of self-respect within toxic family dynamics. First, we realized that being family does not give anyone a permanent license to abuse your trust or steal your future, because true kinship is defined by respect and not just by shared blood. Second, we learned that karma is not a random occurrence, but a precise mathematical outcome of the choices we make and the cruelty we inflict upon those who are most vulnerable. Finally, we understood that choosing to walk away from a toxic relative is not an act of malice, but a courageous declaration of your own worth and a necessary step toward genuine healing. I want to thank every one of you for standing by us and listening to our story as we fought for the justice that my mother so rightfully deserved after years of suffering. I would love to hear your thoughts on this final outcome and whether you believe that forgiveness should ever be granted to those who betray their own parents for financial gain. Please share your personal perspectives in the comments below so that we can support each other in navigating the complex and often painful realities of family betrayal. Thank you for watching and supporting our journey toward a new beginning filled with truth and the unwavering power of a daughter's love for her mother, and I will see you in the next story.